The fluorescent lights of the Pine Valley storage facility hummed overhead as Frank Morrison wheeled himself through the crowd of bidders, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair with practiced ease. At 63, Frank carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen both the best and worst of what life could offer. His left leg ended just below the knee, a souvenir from a patrol in Kandahar where he'd stepped on an IED that changed everything. Retirement hadn't been a choice. It had been thrust upon him in a blur of hospital corridors, rehabilitation sessions, and pitying looks from former colleagues who didn't know what to say to a man who'd given his leg for his country. The army pension kept him fed, but it couldn't fill the gaping void that once held purpose, camaraderie, and the structure of military life. Storage auctions had become Frank's lifeline. It started 6 months after he'd returned home to his empty 2-bedroom house in suburban Arizona. His wife had left 2 years into his deployment, said she couldn't handle the uncertainty anymore. His daughter called once a month if he was lucky, always sounding distracted, always somewhere else. The silence of his days had become deafening. Then one sleepless night, scrolling through channels at 2 a.m., he'd stumbled upon a reality show about storage auctions. Watching strangers gamble on forgotten lives, uncovering treasures and trash with equal enthusiasm, something sparked inside him. It wasn't about the money, though God knew he could use it. It was about the hunt, the mystery, the possibility that behind any rusted door might be something that mattered. That first auction he barely bid, just watched from the back, learning the rhythms, studying the regulars. By his third, he'd won a unit for $75 and found a collection of vintage military medals inside. He'd spent hours researching each one, tracking down the family of the deceased veteran who'd owned them, and hand-delivered them to a grateful grandson who wept when Frank placed them in his hands. That moment, seeing meaning restored to forgotten things, had awakened something Frank thought the landmine had destroyed. Now every Saturday morning he was here. The regular bidders nodded at him with respect. They'd learned that the quiet man in the wheelchair had an eye for value and a stubborn streak that made him dangerous when he wanted something. Today felt different though. Frank couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way the autumn sun slanted through the facility's high windows, or the electric anticipation crackling through the crowd. But as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the concrete, announcing Unit 217, Frank felt his pulse quicken in a way it hadn't since he'd worn the uniform. Something important was waiting behind that door. He could feel it in his bones. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Dale who'd been running these auctions for 15 years, grabbed the padlock on Unit 217 with theatrical flair. "All right folks, this is a good one. Owner's been delinquent for 18 months. No contact, no nothing. Let's see what we got." The lock clattered to the concrete floor, and Dale heaved the rolling door upward with a metallic screech that echoed through the facility. Frank positioned his wheelchair for a better view, craning his neck as the crowd pressed forward. The usual jostling for position began, veterans of the auction circuit elbowing each other, phones out to snap quick photos before Dale inevitably barked at them to put the cameras away. But Frank didn't need a photo. The image seared itself into his memory instantly. The unit was packed, but not in the chaotic way most abandoned storage spaces were. This was organized, deliberate. Furniture wrapped in moving blankets lined one wall, a dresser, what looked like a desk, perhaps a bookshelf. Boxes labeled in neat handwriting were stacked with military precision. But none of that mattered. In the center of the 10 by 15 space, commanding attention like a monument, sat a wooden crate. It was massive, easily 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and tall enough that Frank estimated it stood nearly 5 feet high. The wood was dark, aged, reinforced with metal bands that had oxidized to a deep rust brown. Stenciled markings covered its surface, but from this distance Frank couldn't make out the words. What he could see were the warnings, fragile and faded red paint. "This side up," with arrows. And something else, partial letters that might have been a military designation. His trained eye caught details others missed. The craftsmanship of the crate suggested it wasn't hardware store material. This was custom-built, designed to protect something specific. The metal reinforcements weren't decorative, they were functional, meant to withstand transport, maybe even rough handling. And those stencils. Frank had seen markings like that before in military cargo holds and supply depots. "What the hell did you ship home?" Frank murmured under his breath. Around him, other bidders were already calculating. Big Mike, who ran a second-hand furniture store, was eyeing the wrapped furniture. Teresa, the reseller who specialized in vintage items, had her phone out despite Dale's rules, zooming in on the boxes. But Frank noticed something. Nobody seemed particularly interested in the crate. Too big, too unknown, too much effort. That's what separated amateurs from veterans. Amateurs wanted easy wins. Veterans understood that the biggest mysteries held the biggest payoffs. Dale's voice cut through Frank's thoughts. All right, folks, you know the rules. You buy it, you haul it, you got 72 hours to clear it out. Can't open nothing, can't go inside. What you see is what you get. Let's start the bidding at $100. Frank's hand shot up before his brain fully engaged. This crate had a story. And Frank needed to know it. 100. Frank's voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Dale pointed at him with a grin. Frank's in at 100. Do I hear 125? 125. Big Mike's meaty hand went up. He was stroking his beard, a tell Frank had noticed before. Mike wanted this one. 150, Frank countered immediately, his eyes never leaving the crate. Teresa stepped forward, her phone still clutched in her hand. 200. A ripple went through the crowd. 200 was serious money for a unit this early in the day. Frank felt his jaw tighten. He'd budgeted 300 for today, hoping to snag 2 units. Now he'd have to choose. There was no choice. Not really. 250, Frank said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Big Mike shook his head and stepped back, muttering something about, not worth it for furniture. But Teresa's eyes had that gleam, the same look Frank had seen in soldiers who'd spotted something valuable in a raid. She'd seen something in those boxes, something she recognized. 300, Teresa called out, a satisfied smile playing at her lips. Frank's stomach dropped. That was his limit. The responsible thing would be to walk away. He had bills to pay, groceries to buy, co-pays for his prosthetic maintenance. 300 was already pushing it. But his eyes drifted back to that crate. The stenciled markings. The military-grade construction. The way it sat there like a silent sentinel guarding secrets from another time. Something in his gut, that same instinct that had kept him alive in 2 deployments, screamed that this mattered. He thought of his empty house. The 2 quiet evenings. The way purpose had leaked out of his life like water through cupped hands. 350, Frank heard himself say. The crowd went silent. Even Dale paused, his auctioneer's patter momentarily forgotten. Everyone knew Frank. Everyone knew he didn't play games, didn't get emotional, didn't overbid. Teresa's smile faltered. She glanced at the unit again, doing mental calculations. Frank could see the war in her expression. The boxes probably held vintage items, maybe collectibles, easily $1,000 profit if she was right. But $350 plus the cost of hauling, sorting, listing? $350 going once, Dale called out, his voice tinged with excitement. This was the kind of drama that kept people coming back to auctions. Teresa bit her lip. Her hand started to rise. Then dropped. Going twice, Dale's gavel hand went up. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd just bet more than he should on a mystery he couldn't afford. Sold to Frank Morrison for $350. The crack of Dale's gavel was like a gunshot. Final. Irreversible. As the crowd dispersed, moving toward the next unit, Big Mike clapped Frank on the shoulder. Hope there's something good in there, brother. You just went all in. Frank wheeled himself closer to Unit 217, staring at the crate that was now his. So do I, he whispered. So do I. The rest of the auction day blurred past like scenery through a train window. Frank watched from the sidelines as unit after unit rolled open. A promising-looking 5x10 packed with sporting equipment that went to a young couple for $175, a climate-controlled unit full of what appeared to be restaurant supplies that sparked a fierce bidding war between 2 competing restaurateurs, and a sad little 5x5 containing nothing but trash bags and broken electronics that nobody wanted even at the $50 minimum. Normally, Frank would have jumped on that sporting equipment unit. He could spot quality gear from 20 feet away, and there'd been at least 3 mountain bikes visible from the door. Easy profit. But his wallet was empty and his mind was elsewhere. Every few minutes, his gaze drifted back toward Unit 217. His unit now. The door was closed again, padlocked with his own lock, waiting for him. That crate sat in there in the darkness, patient and mysterious, like it had been waiting 18 months just for him to find it. By noon the auction wrapped up. Dale collected payments, handed out access paperwork, and reminded everyone about the 72-hour clearance deadline. Frank paid his $350, watching his checking account balance drop to a number that made his stomach clench, and wheeled himself back to Unit 217 with the kind of anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The padlock clicked open. The door rolled up with that same metallic screech. But now the space belonged to him. Every secret it held was his to uncover. Frank started with the practical stuff, the responsible veteran's approach to reconnaissance. He unwrapped one of the moving blankets and found exactly what he expected. A solid oak dresser, mid-century modern style, worth maybe $200 to the right buyer. Good. That would recoup some of his investment. The boxes along the wall contained books, kitchen items, linens, ordinary detritus of a life interrupted. Nothing special. Nothing that explained the 18-month abandonment. He saved the labeled boxes for later, working methodically around the perimeter, cataloging everything with the discipline of his military training. 20 minutes in, he'd mentally calculated about $600 in resellable goods. Not a home run, but not a disaster either. But the crate. God, the crate kept pulling his attention like gravity. It sat there in the center of the unit, unmoved, unchanged, utterly dominating the space. Now that he was alone with it, Frank could see more details. The wood was solid, probably pine, aged to a deep honey color. The metal bands were bolted through, not just wrapped around. And those stencils. Frank wheeled himself closer, his hand reaching out to touch the rough wood surface. His fingers traced the faded letters, U.S. Army. Handle with care. Authorized personnel only. The mystery had consumed him long enough. It was time to know. Frank looked around the empty facility, then back at the crate. His hands moved to the edges, searching for a way in. All right, he whispered. Let's see what you're hiding. The crate had no obvious opening mechanism. No hinges visible on the outside, no convenient latch or handle. Frank ran his hands along every surface, feeling for seams, for weaknesses, for any indication of how this thing was meant to be accessed. Designed to stay closed, he muttered, recognizing military engineering when he saw it. Whatever was inside, someone had wanted it protected. The question was, protected from damage or protected from discovery? He wheeled back to his truck and retrieved his toolbox, a battered red Craftsman kit that had survived 2 deployments and 15 years of civilian life. Inside, he selected a flathead screwdriver and a small pry bar. The metal bands would have to come off first. The bolts were corroded, fused with rust and time. Frank worked at the first one methodically, patient despite the electricity humming through his nerves. The screwdriver slipped twice, scraping his knuckles. He barely noticed. Finally, with a screech of protesting metal, the first bolt surrendered. 1 down. 7 to go. 40 minutes later, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool November air, Frank removed the last metal band. It clattered to the concrete floor with a sound like a prison door opening. The wooden crate sat before him, slightly less imposing now but still sealed tight. The seam was nearly invisible, masterful carpentry designed to be airtight. Frank worked the pry bar into the tiny gap along what he'd determined was the top panel. The wood groaned. Decades-old nails shrieked as he applied steady pressure. Come on, Frank breathed. Come on. With a crack that echoed through the storage unit, the top panel shifted. Just an inch. But it was enough. Frank's hands trembled as he set down the pry bar and worked his fingers into the gap. The wood was heavy, solid, but it lifted, slowly revealing darkness within. A smell emerged, not decay but age. Dust and old paper and something else. Oil maybe. Preservative. He propped the lid against the side of the crate and peered inside. Padding. Heavy industrial padding, the kind used to ship delicate instruments. Frank pulled it away layer after layer like unwrapping a mummy. His heart hammered against his ribs. Beneath the padding, another layer. This one was canvas, wrapped tight and secured with ties that had stiffened with age. Frank's fingers fumbled with the knots. His military training screamed at him to be careful, methodical, but his curiosity was a living thing now, demanding satisfaction. The canvas fell away. Frank sucked in a breath. Wrapped in oilcloth, perfectly preserved, was a rifle case. Not just any case. Leather, embossed with markings he recognized immediately. Military issue but old. Very old. and beneath it he could see the edges of something else. Papers. Documents. A smaller box made of metal. What the hell were you transporting? Frank whispered to the absent owner. His hands reached for the rifle case, lifting it carefully from the crate. It was heavier than he expected. The leather was cracked but intact. And on the side, burned into the material with precision, was a name. Frank's blood ran cold. He knew that name. Colonel James T. Morrison. 1st Infantry Division. Frank's father. The rifle case trembled in his hands. This wasn't possible. His father had died in Vietnam in 1971, 3 years before Frank was even born. His mother had raised him alone, never remarrying, keeping his father's memory alive through stories and a single framed photograph that sat on her mantel until the day she died. But Frank had never seen this. Never knew this existed. With shaking hands he unlatched the case. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, lay a pristine M1 Garand rifle. Not a standard issue, this one had been modified, customized. The wood stock was polished to a mirror shine, engraved along the side with coordinates and dates. Frank recognized some of them: battle sites, places his father had fought, places his father had survived until he didn't. Tears blurred Frank's vision as he set the rifle carefully aside and reached deeper into the crate. The metal box came next. Military green, about the size of a shoebox, sealed with a simple clasp. Inside, medals. Purple Heart. Bronze Star. Silver Star with oak leaf cluster. Commendation medals Frank didn't even recognize. And beneath them, a stack of letters bound with string, yellowed envelopes addressed in his father's handwriting. To Margaret Morrison. To my unborn child. Frank's chest constricted. His mother's name. Letters his father had written but never sent. Or perhaps had sent, and his mother had carefully preserved, only for them to end up here, forgotten in a storage unit for 18 months. He set the box aside with reverence and looked back into the crate. More emerged, a dress uniform wrapped in plastic, still crisp and perfect. Dog tags on a chain. A field journal, leather-bound, filled with his father's cramped handwriting. Photography albums containing black and white images of young soldiers, some grinning at the camera, others staring with the 1,000-yard stare Frank knew too well. And then, at the very bottom, beneath layers of documentation, service records, commendations, after-action reports, Frank found a large manila envelope. Seal. Marked, "For my son." To be opened only by James Franklin Morrison Jr. His name. His full name. The one only his mother ever used. Frank's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter, typed on official Army letterhead, dated March 15, 1971, 2 weeks before his father was killed in action. "Dear son," it began. "By the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. Your mother is 8 months pregnant with you as I write this, and I've arranged for these items to be shipped home if I don't return. I'm writing this because I need you to know who your father was, not just the hero your mother will tell you about, but the man. The scared kid from Arizona who volunteered because he believed in something bigger than himself." Frank read through tears, his father's voice speaking across 54 years, across death itself, finally reaching him. The letter was 10 pages long. At the end, a revelation that made Frank's world tilt. "I've arranged for a trust fund. It's been managed by my brother, your Uncle Richard. When you find this, and I pray you do, contact him. There's more to tell you. More I couldn't put in writing. Find him, son. Learn the rest." Frank had no Uncle Richard. Had never heard that name in his entire life. Frank spent 3 days in that storage unit, reading every letter, studying every photograph, memorizing his father's handwriting like it was scripture. He barely slept. Barely ate. The world outside ceased to exist as he absorbed 54 years of missing history. Finding Uncle Richard took less effort than Frank expected. A simple internet search. Richard Morrison, brother of James T. Morrison, 1st Infantry Division. The results led him to a small law office in Prescott, Arizona, 2 hours north of Frank's home. Richard Morrison, attorney at law. Retired. Age 78. The phone call was surreal. "I've been waiting for this call for 54 years, Richard's voice had cracked with emotion. "Your father made me promise. Made me swear I'd keep the trust going until you found him. I never stopped hoping." The drive to Prescott felt like a pilgrimage. Frank's truck hummed along Highway 69, the rifle case secured in the passenger seat beside him like a sacred relic. His father had traveled these same roads once, young and alive and full of dreams Frank would never know firsthand. Uncle Richard's office was modest, tucked above a hardware store in downtown Prescott. The old man who answered the door had his father's eyes. Frank saw it immediately. Those same eyes from the photographs, now weathered by time but unmistakable. They embraced like the family they'd always been but never known. The trust fund was substantial, his father's military benefits, carefully invested and compounded over 5 decades. $230,000. Enough to change Frank's life. Enough to pay off his house, upgrade his prosthetic, maybe even take that trip to Ireland his ex-wife had always wanted but they'd never afforded. But it wasn't the money that mattered. Not really. It was the uncle who invited him to Sunday dinners. The cousin he never knew he had, Richard's daughter, Sarah, who worked as a physical therapist and immediately started researching better prosthetic options for him. It was the family photo albums Richard had kept, filled with pictures of his father as a child, a teenager, a young man before the war. It was belonging to something again. Being part of a story that extended beyond his own broken timeline. 3 months later, Frank stood in front of storage unit 342 at a facility across town. Different location, same Saturday morning ritual. But everything had changed. He'd used some of the trust money to upgrade his wheelchair, to invest in better tools, to expand his auction budget. But more than that, he understood now what he'd been searching for all along. Not treasure. Not profit. Not even purpose exactly. Connection. History. The threads that bind us to people we've never met and stories we've never heard. He thought of his father's letter, carried now in his wallet, creased from constant handling. Live fully, son. Love deeply. Never stop searching for truth. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the facility. Another unit. Another mystery. Another chance to uncover someone's forgotten story. Frank raised his hand to bid, and as he did, he whispered the words that had become his morning prayer. Thank you, Dad. I love you.